Good evening, good morning, good afternoon. Welcome to another cold case file here on 411 Now. Today we're going to be taking a look at a 51-year-old cold case that was recently solved using reverse DNA and genealogical lookup for DNA. Now, this case is unique in another way as well. Over the past 51 years, while this case has sat cold, several individuals were originally targeted and believed to have caused and committed this crime, but the police were never able to find enough evidence to actually charge one of those individuals. And the individual who eventually, came up as the actual perpetrator of this crime wasn't even on the radar of the police. They didn't suspect this individual. They didn't have any other leads or tips or anything that actually pointed to this individual as being the person who committed this crime. So let's jump into it. Thank you. Rapid City authorities say they have solved a cold case after more than 50 years. In a press conference this past Monday afternoon, Rapid City Police Chief Carl Jiggerson spoke alongside Detective Wayne Keefe as they outlined the evidence that pointed to Eugene Carroll Field, a previously unknown suspect in the 1968 murder of Gwen Miller. Today there is a slight celebratory mood because the case has been solved, Jiggers said, but I assure you, the fact of how horrific this crime was wears heavily on our hearts. Miller, 60, a pharmacist, lived alone in Rapid City and had failed to show up for work on February 29, 1968. Her co-workers feared a health issue related to her diabetes, but found the glass of the rear door of her home smashed in when they arrived. Police found Miller dead in her bed with no signs of a struggle in the room, but an autopsy showed she had been sexually assaulted and strangled to death. Fingerprints were taken and tested, witnesses were spoken to, suspects were interviewed, but nothing ever came of the case, and no one was ever arrested. Further efforts were made in 2005, 2010, and 2015. But although authorities managed to get a DNA profile from the suspect, they were unable to determine anything more. Detective Wayne Keefe works part-time investigating cold cases, and he has been working on the Miller case since 2016, interviewing more than 100 people during that time. Keefe reached out to identifiers for a forensics genealogy firm run by Colleen Fitzpatrick for assistance in the case. Fitzpatrick explained at the press conference the process of using genealogical records to find a possible genetic match to the DNA samples. She came back to the police with connections to someone with the last name of either Field or Fields, a name that had no prior mention in the investigation in connection to the case. Using the information, Keefe identified Eugene Carroll Field, a ticketing agent for Western Union at Rapid City Regional Airport, which Miller frequently visited to mail off and ship medications across the United States. He also determined that Fields had rented a room in a house next door to Miller for several months in 1963, 5 years prior to this actual event. Keefe interviewed two women who had been married to Field. Both the women reported their ex-husband was an abusive man who had a strong disdain for women in general. He also contacted Field's only sibling, a brother, who provided a DNA sample. The DNA sample, when analyzed and compared to the DNA from the case scene, showed a 99.23% probability from being a full sibling. Keefe said, There was enough evidence to charge Fields with first-degree murder, but he died in 2009. The results of a tumor in his throat that grew until it cut off his air supply. Multiple members of Miller's family were in attendance at the conference, including her niece Kay Miller Temple, who spoke briefly thanking authorities and everyone who assisted in the case. The family of Gwen Vivian Miller offers you the gratitude and our appreciation, she said through tears. Thank you for giving us the answers. You may remember this story as it was featured multiple times on Unsolved Mysteries and on several other law shows that dealt with cold cases. America's Most Wanted being the most prolific of those. And it was also featured in a documentary series on cold cases here in America. But after 51 years, they now know who killed Vivian Miller. So, who was Gwen Vivian Miller, who went by her middle name, Vivian? Who was she? Vivian, besides being a pharmacist, enjoyed volunteering within her community through her local church. She was a member of the Women's Auxiliary for the Knights of Columbus, and she also volunteered at the library in her spare time, helping to read and teach children how to read and write within her community. Kind of an after-school program that would later take on and was offered by the actual public school system. But in her small community, she did that on her own. Did she date a lot? She did date some, but the men that she was more interested in were the what her friend and her family wrote in an article for her case back in 1975, was that Vivian was more interested into the wild cowboy, the rustic cowboy, who rode the range and lassoed cattle and rode a horse. Those kind of men didn't really live around the area where Vivian worked and lived. So she lived a quiet, secluded life, and keeping to herself in her spare time when she wasn't volunteering. But she was a lovely person and someone that a lot of people in her community looked up to and enjoyed to be around. Quite a few people used to stop into the pharmacy where she worked in as a pharmacist just to say hi to her, to see how she was doing. During those years, the close knit community of people around was everything. You didn't have the internet. You had a close relationship with people, a connection that is not there today in a lot of communities, and yet the internet is supposed to bring us all together. Who was Eugene Carroll Field or Fields? Correct last name is Field, singular. Who was he? Well, he's kind of an odd person, according to the 1975 release of information that was written into the file on this case. He was a unique individual and someone who obviously had a lot of anger issues, according to his ex-wives. He was someone who he worked hard. He kept to himself. He was a very quiet individual, never volunteering, didn't seem to particularly care for anything outside of his work. He wasn't much of a drinker, but he definitely had anger issues that nobody really could pinpoint what was going to set him off next. He just was quiet and he kept everything to himself until he exploded. And nobody could really ever pinpoint who he was or what he was all about. But he kept to himself, he worked, he drove himself his green Pontiac, And that was his love in life, was that car. Four-door green Pontiac with white interior. Most people who knew him knew that he kept that thing immaculately clean inside and out. It wasn't unheard of to see him in the middle of the winter outside washing the car and then rolling it into his garage, making sure that the rock salt from the streets and roadways never destroyed his car.